Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Anderson. The title of this video today is My Message to White People: How I Climbed Out of the Toxic Swamp of Racism and How You Can Too. Now, I heard a joke the other day. It's really not funny, but it illustrates the point about why I felt I had to make this video. A white racist, male or female, with a parrot on his or her shoulder, walks into a bar. The bartender sees this and says, "Hey, where did you get that?" And the parrot says, "America, they're everywhere." Now, if anybody listening to this video should be a racist, it should be me. I grew up in the most blatantly obvious, even sometimes people proud of it, racist environment that you could grow up in the United States of America. I grew up in the Deep South. I was born in 1945, a little town in South Carolina. There were maybe 20,000 or fewer total people in our town, and about 40% of these people were black. Now, when I was a kid, in 1945 and 1950 and 1955 and even into 1960s, they were not called black people. They were called colored people. And everywhere I went in my town, everywhere, there was a sign that says whites and colored. It was on the water fountains. It was on restaurants. It was on the movie theater. When I went to the movies, the black people, or what we called colored people, were in the balcony. They were not allowed to sit downstairs with us, white people, as we watched the movie. They couldn't come to my restaurants. They were not allowed to go to my church. There was a small section of town. I'm hesitating because I have such a struggle with the N word. Thank God for my mother. I'm going to talk about her in a minute. But I was taught as a young child. I don't know where this came from, how it got into my mother's head. But she said to me and to my family, "Do not use that word." So I didn't. And I came to realize it was a blessing that I was taught not to use it. But I was surrounded by people just 80 years after the Civil War. That's not what we called it in this little town. We white people called it the war between the states. And when I was in the 8th grade, we call it middle school now, then we called it junior high, we all had to take a semester's course on the war between the states, as it was called. And while the truth was that slavery was the major reason that the South went to war, in that course, it was only one of, I think, 10 reasons that were given to us about why we, the Southerners, had to go and fight the Yankees. That's the way it was presented. All Confederate generals and soldiers were portrayed as heroic from the time I was a child. The Confederate flag was waved over the American flag where I grew up. How do you not be a racist in that environment? No one was ashamed of it. No one hid it. People used the N word right and left. Thank God for my mother that she didn't let us use it. I went to a totally white church. Now, my church in this little southern town, it was Florence, South Carolina. If you've ever driven from the north to the south or south to the north, you used to go right through the middle of it on 301. Now 95 goes through the very outskirts of the town. You don't see it. 20,000 people, maybe 12, 13,000 were white. My church had 1,200 people attend every single Sunday. It was the biggest church in town. All white, completely white. Everything that I did was segregated. All of the schools I went to, all the way through the time I graduated from the University of South Carolina, which I graduated in 1967 from the University of South Carolina. And I think by that time, because the 60s were exploding with this whole thing about civil rights, there might have been a few black people going to my college. I went on to spend 3 years in a master's degree, Master's of Divinity degree, at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. It was totally segregated. Everywhere I went, black people were almost invisible. And when they did show up in the white part of town, it was only in service positions. Now, I'll just tell you one story about that in a second. But as I looked back on this life experience, I realized that I tried very hard to not be a racist. And I began that journey, I think consciously, aware of it, when I was 15 years old. Now, I was 15 in 1960, and that was the beginning, right around the beginning of the civil rights movement. And the South was in turmoil about it. And it was in turmoil because all the black people had had enough of this crap for almost 400 years. And the white people didn't want to deal with it, did not want to face it, didn't want to deal with it, wanted to shut them up, made all kinds of crap up about them. And there were a few, thank God, a few who started to see the light. Now, there's 3 reasons from my point of view that I was able to begin that journey out of that swamp. Now, I just want to be clear about one thing as I'm talking about this. I am not portraying myself as totally non-racist. I don't think any of us white people have the right to do that, and it's not even accurate. And the reason for that is, as I said before, racism is part of our DNA in this country. We've been in this country, most of us white people, since we were little kids. We were born here. We were deeply affected with it. I left the South in 1970 and moved to Boston. I thought it would be better. There's racism all over Boston then. I went to California. I found racism there. I moved to Hawaii. For 5 years, I lived in Hawaii. Racism is in Hawaii. I moved back to the East Coast of South Florida. Racism is in South Florida. It's like wherever I go, there it is. And I am not portraying myself as a person who's handled all the issues of racism. I am portraying myself as a person who is doing his best to ferret it out in myself, to heal it, to let go of it, to admit to it, to be honest about it, to try to get past it for the good of my own soul and the good of my own nation. So I would never say I'm not a racist. And my opinion is that any white person in this country who says I'm not a racist is naive or uneducated or highly unself-aware, because we all have vestiges of it that creep around inside of us. And those of us who've done a lot of work on it, who've really tried to rid ourselves of that obnoxious, self-hating kind of disease, It still creeps in at different times. We can't afford to say we're done with it. Our country cannot afford it. We need to be speaking up and working on it every single day, starting here. How do I still have some of it? Now, I started this video today with a great sense of sadness and shame. It really bothers me. For two reasons, I feel sad and shameful. One is that there aren't thousands and thousands and thousands of videos out there already like this one. I'm not the only person who feels this way, who's white, who's trying to deal with this. Some people are speaking up, but it needs to be way, way more of us. And I'm ashamed for two reasons. One is I have over 40 videos on YouTube right now, and this is the first one that I've done about racism. And I'm sad about that, and I'm somewhat ashamed about it. I'll be 75 years old in November. I grew up in the worst racist part of this country. And I started to come out of it, and I don't feel that I've done enough about it. I'm not going to beat myself up here today. I'm simply telling you the truth. So this is another step in that process today. So there are three people that I think are responsible for my journey out of racism, who continue to influence me every single day to shed the mud of that swamp. I want to tell you about each one very quickly and then leave you with a couple of thoughts that are really important about what you can do to be part of this process of healing and growth that we really need to be going through right now in our country. First one, as I mentioned already, is my mother. I don't know how she did it, but my mother said, do not use the N-word in this house or in your life. It is a bad word. It's unacceptable. Don't use it. So I didn't use it. And I came to thank her for that, because to this day, when I hear it, it makes me sick. I don't care who says it. It makes me sick. And I think that is a healthy experience, a healthy sickness when you hear that word. To have something twist in your heart. It means you're going in the right direction with your values and how you perceive other people in respect and care. The second thing my mother did, some of it's almost kind of funny to me, is that when I was growing up in the late 40s and 50s in South Carolina, the white women who needed a maid. Now, my mother worked full-time, and she hired a woman, a black woman, to clean our house every Wednesday. As I remember it correctly, I think it was every Wednesday. Her name was Josephine. Josephine worked in our house for us for years, and I came to love her dearly because of how she treated me. But Josephine didn't have a car, as was true about almost all the maids in the black community. They couldn't afford them. So the white women would get in their cars, drive over to that section of town, because that's the only place they were allowed to live, and pick up their maid and drive them back to their house. They would clean the house, they'd take them back. Now, this is the funny part to me. The white women would put the black women in the back seat, because in the white world then, if you had a person sitting next to you in the front seat, it meant a sign of equality. So instead of putting them in the front seat, they put them in the back seat. And to my mind, it looked to me like they were chauffeuring them around. It never made any sense to me. However, my mother always put Josephine in the front seat. Always. I remember going to get Josephine and riding in the back seat, and Josephine would get in the front and I would be in the back seat, and Mom would go back and forth and take her. And my mother talked to that woman as if she was an equal with respect. I never heard her disrespect her in any fashion when Josephine was present or not. I never heard her say a negative, racist word about her. God bless my mother for that. So my mother made a big contribution to start. Then the second person who made a massive effect on me, my mind and my heart, and ultimately my soul and my spirit on the subject of racism was Jesus. Now Jesus was, if you didn't grow up in the South in the 40s and the 50s, it might be hard for you to understand this, but everybody I knew was a Christian. And almost everybody I knew was a Southern Baptist. Now, that's just the way it was. Evangelical conservative Christianity dominated my little town and my family. My mother and everybody, her brothers, her family, my grandparents, everybody went to church at the Baptist church all the frickin' time. I grew up going on Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night and prayer meeting on Wednesday night and vacation Bible school in the summertime. And at 15, I felt a call, a spiritual experience. I felt called to the ministry. I thought I was going to be a minister of a church. That didn't turn out exactly right, but I did the whole thing that you do. That's why I mentioned before that I went to seminary. So I took Jesus and his teachings totally seriously, as did most of the people I knew. Now, for me, it became a very real thing. It wasn't just because my mommy and my daddy taught it to me or because my friends were involved in it. By the time I was 15, it was a real personal experience for me. It still is. And Jesus said some things that I started taking seriously at 15, and I started looking around and saying, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm going to tell you two very quick ones. You can research it if you want. In the New Testament, there's a story in which it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. You can Google it. But essentially, Jesus told a story. Someone asked him, who is my neighbor? And he told a story about a good Samaritan. Now, let me tell you what that meant. If, and I figured this out when I was a teenager, if a white Baptist minister had told this story to his congregation the way it should have been told, he would have lost his job and maybe been run out of town. Because a good Samaritan to the Jewish culture 2,000 years ago would have been very, very similar to black people and white people in Southern culture when I was a child. So if a Baptist minister had told this story and made it applicable to us, he would have said, let me tell you a story about the good colored man. And everybody in the whole group would have gone, what the hell? And they would have stood up, probably run him out of town. But that's the way it should have been interpreted. The story is this Jewish man, or you might say now, this good Southern man went on a trip down this dangerous road. Robbers came out, robbed him, and beat him to about an inch of his life and left him to die on the side of the road. And then a white minister came along. This is the way Jesus would tell the story. A white minister came along, see the guy over there on this side and say, I'm not bothering him. I'm getting out of here. Leave him alone. Then the next thing would be a deacon in the same church would come along and see him, walk away. And then, to use the Southern language then, a colored man would come along, see this white guy beaten up on the side of the road. He would go and help that man. He would pick him up. He would take him to the hospital. And according to Jesus in his story, that colored man would have said to the hospital, I'm coming back in a few weeks. If there is a bill for this guy, I will pay it. Jesus said, that is a good neighbor. Now, that story didn't get told that way almost at all in the white South, but that's the way Jesus would have had it told now. I'm totally convinced of that. The second thing that Jesus said that really got to me about this whole racist poison is he said, you can look this up too, even as you have done it unto the least of these, the people that you think are the least of these, you have done it unto me. Now, you gotta love this guy. The radical way he looked at spirituality and told us how to live. When I was 15 or 16, I took that 100%. I thought that's what he meant, and he did. So people around me wouldn't apply it to how they treated black people. They didn't think it applied to their frickin' racism. I started to figure it out. And so by the time I got to seminary, segregated, I realized I couldn't be a Southern Baptist anymore. They were too racist. They were also loving the Vietnam War, and I was very much against that in the 60s. But mostly because of the racism, I decided I couldn't be a Southern Baptist anymore, and I left that denomination and joined the United Church of Christ. At that point, it was the most liberal of all Christian denominations. It happens to be the church that Barack Obama belongs to. And it took me to Boston. I thought I was going to get out of that stuff naively. When I moved to Boston, it was still there. But that's the story of how Jesus moved me and still does. Because his words, his guidance for me is primary about how I make my decisions in this world. And that's a powerful anti-racist statement to me. Okay, third person. Third person was Carl Jung, J-U-N-G, psychologist, depth psychologist. Now, Carl Jung taught us something about what he called the shadow. It's too involved for me to go into it right now in depth, but simply what I will say to you is that we all have a shadow, meaning we all have parts of ourselves that we don't like, we hate, we despise, we're uncomfortable with. We push them unconsciously out of our awareness. And once we do that, that's called the shadow. I think of it as back over my right shoulder. It's not really there, but that's where I think of it. What we do with that is we either unconsciously act it out unawares, or when it comes to racism, we project those negative qualities onto people that we see as very different and strange. We assign to them the characteristics we hate, despise, and deny in ourselves. And so Jung taught us about the shadow. Racism lives, at least partially, in the shadow of every single white person who lives in this country. That's a psychological truth. It's not just Matthew Anderson's interpretation. It's a reality. And to the degree we are racist is the degree we have projected our own negative, hateful parts onto, in this case, people of color. Not just black people, people of color, but we're talking mostly here about racism towards black people. And so Carl Jung has taught me something. Now, here's something about racism. I'm going to read you what I wrote so I don't get it wrong here. Self-love and racism cannot exist in the same heart at the same time. Racism is thinly disguised self-hate that is projected onto those who are strange or different. We can't love ourselves and hate and be prejudiced against other people. We can't do it. They don't exist in the same way. To the degree you are a racist is to the degree you have self-hate in your own heart. Now, I've come to see that self-hate is an extremely destructive thing. Because if I hate myself, I'm going to treat you in a hateful way. If I love myself, I'm going to treat you out of that self-love, and I'm going to treat you in ways that are good for you and good for me. It's a simple psychology 101. So racism is a form of projected self-hate. And you can judge how much self-hate you've got by how much racism seems to be present in you. So racism is bad for everybody under every circumstance. Now, what can you do about it? If you're a white person, what can you do about it? Well, the first place to start is right here, the person you see in the mirror. And say to yourself, there's got to be some parts of me that are still racist. I need to pay attention to them. I need to find them, even if they're very subtle. Even if they're very subtle. I've got to look for them. I have to identify them and admit to them, because it's been part of the DNA in the swamp that I was born into. So that's one thing we need to do as white people, is look for our own racism, and don't say, I don't have that disease. I could go on about that one forever, but the people who say I don't have a racist bone in my body have got no bones. They're like puddles on the floor because they got no bones. Everybody's got some. Number 2, look to your higher power for direction about this. Now, Christians should be looking to Jesus. Jews should look to the Torah. Buddhists should look to Buddha. Muslims to the Quran. New Agers to the universe and all the other sources of higher power. Agnostics and atheists also can look for the highest source of ethics that you can find. We all have a higher power, higher source that we can look to and say, that's where I should find my best guidance about how to treat other people who seem to be different from me, even if it's just the color of their skin. Ask for that direction. I do it every single day. I say to myself, I pray the prayer every single day of my life, please, I am opening myself to God's divine guidance in this day and everything I'm doing. You do that in whatever religious or spiritual tradition you feel is important to you, you will become less of a racist the moment you start doing that. Number 3, everybody can do this because we have Google now. Get educated about racism. How many of you knew that in 1619, the first 20 slaves came to the United States, to Jamestown, Virginia, and nobody said, what the hell is going on? We don't do racism here. Nobody. When the South went to war with the North, over 60% of the economy of the South was based on slavery. That's why they fought that stupid war. And they killed hundreds of thousands of Americans due to that. There was something like 4 million slaves in the South when that war started. And I'm ashamed to say the first shot was fired in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. Get educated about racism. Go on Google. You can type in what white people need to know about racism. You can type in the word racism. You can type in any word related to it and look for what's coming up and pick the ones to watch that take you to the highest source of ethics and psychology and spirituality. Look for those, the ones that lift you up. And number 4, speak up and act up. Now, speak up in the way that you feel is the best for you. For many people, it could be at the dinner table when somebody says a racist thing and you say, wait a minute, I'm trying to deal with that myself. And I think of that as a racist statement, and I'm trying not to be that way anymore myself. So let's talk about what that means and try to figure out a way to get past that, because that's destructive to all of us. Act up. You can be in a protest. You can write a letter. You can talk to people. You can join organizations. Most importantly, don't be silent. Do not be silent. Every moment we as white people are silent, without realizing it, we are giving our blessing to racism. We cannot afford to continue to be silent about racism in this country. It needs to be healed in all of us, starting with me and including you. May God bless you and bless us and fill us as we try now to take a giant step together out of this swamp. God bless you.